was my
I kept
stomach.
on going, and then the wind came up. And now the wind was actually worse than when I reached over. So about a minute and a half ride was 18 minutes long because they stopped the ride every time the wind came up. Now at the end, I was just kind of relieved, but I really didn't understand what happened to my brain because of that experience till 2 years later. And I took my family up to San Francisco, and there was this Macy's building where they had a series of amusement rides, including a Ferris wheel. So I thought, what could be wrong with a Ferris wheel? So my son and I got in it, and it just started. And then my son started doing what I was doing in that chair before, jerking it back and forth, up and down, and my hands froze to the rail. I literally couldn't unclench my hands. And all the memories of what happened with me and my daughter came rushing back. And I could see I was beginning to develop the internal response that individuals that have phobias begin to experience, where your brain makes a bookmark of a scary experience and says, I don't want to go here again. And your conscious mind might forget, but your unconscious mind doesn't forget. So as I shared my story, I want to hear about some of your stories. The different forms of anxiety that some of you have experienced, or maybe someone that you love or care for has experienced. So we can give everybody in this room an opportunity to recognize that none of us are alone. None of us are completely unique. And I was hoping you had names because I love to call on people when nobody volunteers.
I'll do that for you.
So I just want you to think about your story and just ask the question, is it possible that God can use my story to help someone else that's here today? And maybe more of a profound way than you know. And maybe that was even part of the purpose of you being here. It wasn't so much what you were going to learn, but what you were going to share. So since I don't have the names, before I start picking on people based on the clothes they're wearing, is there somebody that would like to volunteer? All right, someone in the back? White sweater?
Yes.
Your name?
Jean.
Jean. Great.
We'll have to experiment with this. If this doesn't work, we'll figure out ways of having you come closer to the camera or so that's the computer. Hey, Jean, actually, why don't we just do that? Are you comfortable coming up here?
Am I comfortable or?
Are you comfortable coming up this way? Are you uncomfortable coming up this way?
Touching.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna kind of put her off to the side.
Great.
Just so she doesn't block the view of folks, and you can face Dean a little bit. Sorry, guys, this is the way we have, it's the first time doing this, so.
Now you know not to volunteer.
Yeah. And you can do it in your chair also. So I'll just point you toward her just for a moment here, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
There she is.
Okay. My experience is that March 17th, I fell down a flight of stairs, 4 stairs only, not a flight, caught my heel, pitched forward, landed on my nose. But it's not the first time I've broken my wrist. The other time was on ice, and I've been very careful around ice. Won't even walk on ice. But now I'm experiencing stairs. I don't want to go downstairs. And especially those stairs that I fell down. So, because I broke my wrist, had to have surgery. It's been, anybody who's only been one-handed, you appreciate Johnny Erickson Tata. I listen to her a lot just to focus on, it's not as bad as you think it is, Jean. But I am glad I am in a church where there are no stairs. So that's my story.
Thank you so much, Jean, for sharing that.
Yeah.
Just an appreciation about how that actually made you relive the previous experience, huh?
Anybody else? If you, yeah, yeah. Just do your little intro to him and.
Hi, I'm Colleen.
Hi, Colleen.
Hi, I will share about a loved one who has anxiety that has been different levels of anxiety since we've been together. But I remember really realizing that it was a mental thing that he couldn't control. One time our first dog that we had together, she had to go to the animal hospital, and we were in the little room with her, and all of a sudden he like seized up and like fell on the floor, and like he couldn't move because he was having an anxiety panic attack. That was one of the first times I ever got to call 911 because I was so freaked out. Luckily the veterinarian came in and was, kind of talked him through it, and he was fine. And you don't know, but I'm talking about my husband, Seth. He plays guitar and sings, so you guys have probably seen him. And for me, who I don't struggle with anxiety, that was like the first time that I really saw how it can affect you physically. So that's
Wow.
That's it.
Powerful, vulnerable. Thank you for your transparency.
Did ask him if I could share.
I can't look front.
Okay,
You hear me?
would it be helpful if I repeat it to him?
Yeah.
Yep.
I have a great anxiety of falling.
Great anxiety of falling. She can't come forward here.
I have a walker.
She has a walker. Yeah.
It's so bad that before I get out of bed, I calculate how I'm gonna get out of bed, how I'm gonna face my feet, and then walking to the apartment.
So she says that, can you hear that at all? If not, okay.
Yes.
You can? Okay.
And so it's.
So what I hear you saying is that it really kind of captures 100% of your attention, doesn't it?
Yes. And it's sometimes.
That you actually have to be very conscious of steps you take, getting up and so on.
And my
for fear of
balance
what happened.
bad lately. So
Her balance
that's
is bad as well, physiologically.
That's my story.
Thank you.
And that you understand that for a lot of us that are getting younger, as we enter into those ages, falling becomes probably one of the biggest things that we fear.
Yeah, 2 years
Because usually
ago,
when you fall, something injures or breaks, and you're not the same after that. So it's a big deal.
years ago, I broke my hip, my knee, and my ankle all in one fall.
Hip, knee, and ankle in one fall a couple of years ago. Broke.
All right. Someone else?
Yeah, Chuck.
Yes.
Good morning, my name's Chuck. Thank you for giving us.
Chuck, good to meet you.
This opportunity at Southside. My story is, my wife and I had 3 children. I lost my son to cancer in 2012. And I lost my wife in 2019 to cancer. And being a widower, it's only been my faith in the Lord Jesus Christ that I've been able to walk forward in life. I accepted Christ as an 8-year-old boy. I'm very thankful. And it's been through those 2 precious deaths in my life that God has used them for my good, for His glory. But still at that, I struggled for a few years, depression. And by His walk that I've been able to walk forward. Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Someone else? I wonder which one of the three in the front row have been just waiting to say something. But not yet. Somebody's standing up right there. And you?
My name's Carrie, and I'm kind of here in a couple different roles. So, found out this year that my son, who is in college, had severe amounts of anxiety. And so to the point where we now have him in therapy and some things like that, that some people at college came alongside and recognized it. And then he came and talked to his dad and I. And so I'm kind of here because I'm the type of person that it's like, suck it up, buttercup. And so I'm kind of here to learn what it is that sees that. Now, I was a worrier myself, but I became a believer like when I was in junior high, and just kind of, it was very easy for me to say, take it, Lord, and I'm confident you got it. And now I always look at worst case scenario and work my way back and see if I can live with the worst case. So I outthink it, I think. So then when I see other people who don't have that ability to do it, it's like, what's your problem? You know what I mean? Type thing. Plus then, I'm also an administrator at a Christian school that we started 2.5 years ago here. And I say we because there's some friends and I that started it together, and we work as a leadership team to administrate to this. And so you see, ever since COVID, it doesn't matter. The way the world is for teenagers right now is just, and I'm at a Christian school, and we talk about Jesus every single day and before school starts, whatever it happens to be. But recognizing with my personality and my co-administrator is kind of same thing. We want to be able to recognize it and hear it and see it and validate it in people, kind of like you talked about how you see the physical sides of it, but you don't, it's real. And how do you do that, but then also give people tools that help them to know that they can move forward, trusting in the person who has the truth to help them work through it. So that's kind of, so there's a couple different stories there, so.
Well, what you're sharing is a powerful thing, and that is for those that haven't had a struggle in this arena. It is very easy to have a position of just not being able to relate and not being able to understand and being quick to judge. So how great for you to come to a place where you want to understand more, learn more, and you appreciate the pain and the suffering of the students that you have, and you're trying to step in that in a deeper way. Good for you. So which are one of you three guys in the front row would you like to go first?
So my name's Nate. So
Nate, good to meet you.
very nice to meet you. So I visited Southside a long time ago, and then I ended up coming back here, and now I'm here calling this my home. And I have a 16-year-old, almost 17-year-old daughter who has Down syndrome and autism, and her anxiety is off the charts. And everything she does is anxious, and she'll spin. And me, I'm in the military, I'm very type A, and I'm that like, hey, I got an issue, fight, flight, or freeze. I'm that fighter. I just move towards it and try and blow it up and get rid of it and deal with it. That doesn't work so well with my daughter. And so, but I've been able to help her with tools and working to teach myself. And I come to learn tools on how to, like, people are my thing. And I'm all about, like, people are our most important asset in life. And so as we love people, we learn to do that better. Everybody's different, and how to bring what I have, but also learn what other people have as tools to go against this, as I'm in a phase also with other stuff where my future is unsure and I don't know what that looks like. So.
Yeah. Wow. So you have a trifecta there.
Yeah.
You
Lot
have,
going on.
and how old is she?
She's gonna be 17 in June.
Yeah, so teenager, Downs, autistic, all three of those have their own issues and their own challenges. And to have them all be comorbidity in terms of combination of that, what a obstacle course to walk through. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
So which of the two of you in the front row?
Well, I'll go. Dean, I'm Colin, one of the pastors here, and
Colin.
the main source of my anxiety is the guy in the red right on the corner there. So if you could do something about him, that would be great. No, I would say I actually I never thought of myself as an anxious person, but as I kind of dug into anxiety and how it manifests in different people, I realized that my response to anxiety is usually more of a strictness or a unwillingness to budge or to adapt to the situation, just to kind of say, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to move forward. And so for me, it's kind of realizing that I don't walk around feeling like, oh no, everything's terrible, but I get more, insulated and more, more unwilling to compromise or cooperate or those kind of things. So yeah, thank you for doing this
Very
today.
All right, very good. So we're going to be addressing some of that, Colin. That'd be great. Yeah. Anyone else would like to share before we begin? All right, one more.
My name is Debbie, and
Debbie, good to meet you.
nice meeting you. Comes from my daughter. She's nearly 48, but over the course of years, we've been estranged, and she has a very dominant personality that's progressed, over time, and to the point where it frightens me, to where I almost see that, is it demonic, force within her? She's unreasonable. And I know that, but anyway, so my plan of strategy is, I avoid her. I don't call her, I don't have a relationship with her. And she's, as far as I can tell, she's really kind of dived down deep into the ways of the world, if I can just generalize it without giving out too many details. And it's kind of frightening.
Well, thank you for sharing. That's the second way that we can respond. Nate was talking about going right to fight. And a part of, that you chose the second one, you went to flee. And those are things that happen when we're exposed to things that can be overwhelming and threatening. Well, let me walk through a little about what we want to do today. We want to kind of build on Mark's sermon on the why is this subject is so important. Number two, what are the mechanics of how the brain works and how you and I can utilize that from not just an understanding standpoint, being able to write to others, but knowing how to step in and use language that is not just good for yourself, but for others. And finally, just having some general skills and some very specific strategies when it comes to a word that you're going to hear from me a lot, and that is it's the old adage, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. That's so much of emotional management we're going to find is built on the idea of having a plan ahead of time, not waiting for the storm to come and then trying to put up a storm shelter. And coming to awareness that when it comes to changing our strategic responses, it's heavily loaded in the front end with work because you're actually changing habit formation. But to get from a place of what we call unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence, you don't get to skip the middle and in between. Being conscious of your incompetence and conscious of having to be competent. Like I think Jean was sharing in the back about being so conscious about how she gets out of bed and how she steps. There's a phase that you and I have to go through like that to internalize natural responses that you can actually use in real time. That really you can't even access when you're under stress if you haven't been practicing. But we can talk more about that. Well, let me just pray that the Lord would bless our time and other stories would come out that would be helpful for all of us that we can relate to in some way or another. And that what specific thing that you're needing to hear would be manifest and clear to you. Lord, I just thank you just for the way in which you choose an instrument and you refine it, you strengthen it, and you speak through it. We recognize where Paul was the one who planted and Apollos was the one who watered. It was always you that gave the increase. So I'm praying that whatever comes out of today, we'll experience you giving the increase, you giving the benefit in very specific ways, but the hearts and the minds that are here today. In your son's name, amen. So why is it important? Well, 27.3% of Americans right now are reporting anxiety issues. 41.7 young adults, 18 to 29 are reporting it. 6% of teens have experienced higher levels during the pandemic. 31% of college students. It's both males and females, the percentages are growing exponentially. 7.1 had US of the US population have social anxiety. 60.76% of health workers, the same. It's like an epidemic. Not just the pandemic, but now an epidemic when it comes to mental health issues, especially anxiety, because of that. When they looked at the most stressed countries, 74% of the people in Lebanon report to be anxious. 74% in Afghanistan, 64% Turkey. Imagine a population that is mainly run by people that every day wake up with dread and agitation, and how frightening that is. Mark knows a pastor friend of ours who has a mission in the Middle East and actually has a section of that in Lebanon. And his group was there when that bomb went off. If you ever heard of the bomb that went off in Lebanon, where what actually happened was it was actually not just a factory, it was a munitions factory that was hidden. And 3 miles away, windows were blown out. And the phenomenal opportunities that worked out in terms of the gospel. So many people, especially Muslims, have come to Christ during this time because Christians have been very similar to the early Romans. And if you know anything about the early Roman Christians, what you know is that one of the reasons why persecution of Christians was stopped was because the Roman leaders got together and basically came to the conclusion that the Christians, the people of faith, not only took care of their own people, but were taking care of our people. So we can't afford to keep on persecuting them. They're basically handling our social welfare system. Isn't that great? That's always the way the body of Christ rises up, to see the opportunity in the midst of the danger. But now it's gone up to 31% of people in the US are reporting to be anxious. That just seems to be increasing. And, you know, one of the major things that we begin to see is that almost everybody is beginning to, if they're really honest, reporting some level of anxiety about something. So what we want to be able to do is recognize, especially from the younger generation, and even though all of you have a right to be anxious as well, there's never been the percentage of younger people feeling anxious as there have been today. Now, because I'm a product of the 50s and 60s, and 60s were labeled as a time of the age of anxiety, if you can imagine that. Nothing like today, because there was, in neighborhoods, there was a solidarity, there was a sense of community much richer than you have today. There was, you know, one of the worst inventions ever happened was the garage door opener. You know why? Because when I was coming home at 5:30, all the trucks would coming down the street, all the fathers that were in the trades, and their garage door would be open for the next 2 or 3 hours as they had dinner, and then they'd be working in their garage, and people would leave their garage to go to the other person's garage, and there would be community and sharing and working together on whatever projects were there, and so on and so forth. When you have community, it's amazing how it makes up for a lot of things. And so when, Colin, you're talking about loneliness and I'm sure you're going to be getting to how probably the real tragedy of the pandemic was the toxic level of loneliness that spread like wildfire, especially with people that were older. And as many people were reported to have maybe died of COVID, probably miraculously died of loneliness and gave up the will to live because they had nothing to live for in their mind. So I want you to think in terms of, because of what was said already about how we can have responses that are kind of less than compassionate. I want you to think in terms of maybe some of the comments that you've been exposed to when, and maybe even you were tempted to say yourself, that aren't helpful to people that are feeling anxious. And just take a moment and a piece of paper, just write down maybe some of the comments you've heard sent in the direction of somebody that was anxious, that you can look back on and realize not only was that counterproductive, it was destructive. Anyone like to volunteer? What came to their mind?
Pull up by your bootstraps.
Pardon?
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Okay, yeah, that's popular. In fact, that was number one on the list of the 10 things not to say. We all get anxious, so just pull yourself together. Give me another one.
It's okay. You'll be okay.
All right, all right. Kind of premature reassurance. All right. Anything else? Get a life? Okay.
Yeah.
You know the difference between a problem and an inconvenience.
Ah,
Did you?
anyone else?
That was on the end.
Anyone else?
This is an opportunity to learn how to trust God more.
Ah, let's spiritualize it. That's not as bad about what you're about ready here. Have you committed some sin that God is punishing you for?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, don't say that?
Says the lead pastor.
Dean, this one might get me into some trouble, but I wrote down, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, submit your requests to God.
Well, how can you argue with scripture?
I know.
So isn't that amazing how the power of scripture is in many ways contextual and also what is said before you share it. The same verse can be profound and life-changing and can be simply cliche in another situation. Some of the other ones, if you would just relax more, your anxiety would go away. Well, that would be fine if I knew how to relax. You worry too much. Worry never changes things. I know. Help me with that. If you would just try harder, you would not feel so stressed out.
That makes sense.
Just ignore your problems, they'll go away. Anxiety cannot kill you, just snap out of it. If you had more faith, you wouldn't be worrying all the time. Take a holiday, you'll all feel better that later. And here's the last but not least, if I can cope with my life, you should be able to cope with yours.
I would say something.
Now, I do appreciate when Joni Erickson says that. And I had an intern that was a quadriplegic. And I love the fact that and he was a VA counselor, and he also was head of the counseling services in Valencia. And when individuals would come in and start whining, he would just start shaking his head and said, "Really? You have something to whine about?" And he had a right to say that, because it was a message to them that if he could do something from where he started, be inspired by his life, and not be just drowning in theirs. But he never said that right away. He always had a relationship to build on before he said it. So let's take a look at what anxiety actually is. Nate already described it in terms of the fight, flight, or freeze response. This brain that God gave us is this phenomenal computer that has all these organic parts in it. They're so finely tuned, including two of the larger parts, one being the limbic system and another part called the neurofrontal cortex. And if you look at it maybe more simpler, and that is, in the back of your brain are these structures: the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, the adrenal glands, and they've been designed to protect you. They're there always as a survival mechanism. They're constantly on the alert for danger. So much so that they can be activated almost instantaneously. And when that part of your brain is activated, you actually go through 12 changes almost immediately. The first thing is there's a release of catecholamines, which is norepinephrine and adrenaline. And you feel this surge of energy going from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet, because it's energizing you for battle. There's an increased sense of blood glucose and fatty acids to your muscle structures, so that now you have access to more strength on a chemical level than you would normally. Give you an example of that, and you've maybe heard stories that seem like stories until they at our home. And was my dad, before he died, was in his motorized wheelchair, and he was on the porch. And he dozed off while she was just working in the garden. He loved to be on the porch watching her work in the garden, and he fell asleep, and he leaned forward and pushed the forward button. And his 350-pound motorized wheelchair threw him off the porch and landed on him. My wife saw it, was there in a second and a half, and as my dad says, she just threw it off of me. 350 pounds, dead weight. And I asked her about it, and she said, "Yeah, I don't know why, I just felt light as a feather." So that's a phenomenal system that God has developed, don't you think? Giving us chemistry that we can do things that normally we can't in our human life do. Increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, blood pressure, increased respiration, vasoconstriction. What that means is that all your capillaries shrink, so that if you get injured, like in battle, you don't bleed as much. Increased clotting factors. So if you do bleed, it sends out platelets ahead of time in prevention, all ready to seize up the hole or the cut or the laceration. Your pupils dilate, so you have a tendency to be very singularly focused, and your eye tracking behavior starts working off the charts. You experience an increased volume of speech and pitch, All those things happen in seconds because of that system. And all those things are good, they do protect you. It's one of the reasons why when that happens, when it occurs, and you're just upset and your limbic system goes off, you feel that desire to raise your voice. You feel that desire to strike out. You feel that desire to hit something or break something because it's this raw energy looking for a way to act itself out. And again, all that's good when it's single-minded and it's driven by getting you out of a burning building. The problem is that response can be hijacked. This happens when the response is based on assumption that the threat is real when it may not be. And unfortunately, that part of your brain has a tendency to believe it's being objective when it's really being subjective. This response is only being vetted by your limbic system, and that's emotionally driven, not rationally driven. So I'm bringing this up because the part of what we want is we want to get access to the part of your brain that does its homework before it acts out. And that's this front part of your brain. So one of the tools, even though it's we're not talking about tools just right now, is to get in the habit of teaching yourself that when those 12 changes begin to happen, it's a signal that you just probably got hijacked if there's not a burning building. And to label it, I just had a chemical response and I need to do what scripture says I need to do when I have a chemical response. Because the part of the brain, your prefrontal cortex, is the part of your brain that is associated with a concept called emotional intelligence. That's the part of you that is self-aware. That's the part of you that can self-reflect, where you do some thinking about an event, get some insight from it, learn from it, do something differently next time. That's this part of your brain that's doing it, not your back part of your brain, this part of your brain. This is the part of the brain that can forecast and say, okay, look before I leap. Where the back part of your brain just wants to leap because it's convinced that's the appropriate thing to do. It's this part of the brain that does your emotional regulation and has the ability to, again, by reflection, determine whether this emotion, it's like if we were just to talk about those three responses, again, anger is your fight, anxiety is your flight, and fear and panic is your freeze. Almost anger is your most protective emotion. But unfortunately, it's run by your limbic system most of the time, which is the wrong place to be run by anything. And so only this part of your brain can sort it out and say, you know what? I don't think I'm angry. I think I'm hurt. I don't think I'm angry. I think I'm scared. I don't think I'm angry. I think I'm frustrated. Only this part of your brain can figure that out. The back part of your brain is saying, I'm angry. I have a right to be angry. All my anger is righteous, and I'm going to act it out. So this part of your brain that has insight, discernment, perspective, that's the foundation for being wisdom driven. And one of the things I would like you to begin to invite yourself to ask on a regular basis as you enter into difficult situations and difficult times and interactions with people is always ask the question, do I want to be wisdom driven or emotionally driven? Because it doesn't take rocket science to figure out the legitimacy of the old adage, make a speech while you're angry and you'll make the best speech you'll ever regret. But what I love about scripture is that it gives us a understanding that God knew this stuff because he's the designer way before, and he communicated these truths through his writers. The letter of James in the Bible, in many ways, is the New Testament version of Proverbs. A series of very thoughtful, short, to the point principles and metaphors that provide practical guidance to how to live your life well. And one of the most brilliant is James 1:19. In it, he provides a divine template to use anytime you're involved in an interaction with others, especially difficult ones. Here's what he says. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not work out the righteous life God invites us to live. Now, before you react to my next sentence, just put a pause button on. But fortunately, this is not an accurate translation of the Greek words that James was using. I say fortune because an accurate translation allows this verse to cover much more territory that is useful for us in our conversation today. The word being challenged that I'm challenging because the Greek is the word anger. The actual word in the Greek language is orge, which means any natural impulse. What is an impulse? An emotional reaction to something, isn't it? Is every reaction you have angry? Can you agree with me? No. Ever been quick to taking something personally? Ever been quick to being resentful? Ever been quick to feeling hurt? When those are emotional reactions because of our limbic system, they're not trustworthy. So the writer is challenging us to slow down when we're emotionally stimulated rather than feeling anger, but actually whatever the feeling is, whether it's anger, fear, hurt, disappointment, upset, letdown. Oops. So I think that where we left off was that the word in the Greek is orge, which means any natural impulse. And again, any kind of impulse is going to be an emotional reaction, not a thoughtful, rational reaction. So the writer is not just challenging us to slow down when it comes to anger, he's asking us to slow down with anything emotional. Not to run with it, not to let it lead you. And the only thing he's asking us to be, everything he's telling us to do is to be slow, except one thing, and that's to listen. So when it comes to you being anxious or anybody else, the first key is to listen. That something important just happened. And I need the time, take the time to slow down and figure it out. Does that make sense? Because again, once I start going down that fast track train of reacting to something, then scary things happen. You know, I've dealt with a number of road ragers in the 45 plus years of doing counseling, and these are all people that were emotionally driven. And they put themselves and other people's lives at stake because of a simple gesture or a simple mistake another driver did. But because their limbic system took over and they were threatened by having to slam their brakes on or what it would be, they personalized it and felt the need to act out and usually went to fight as their response. I'll show you. You can't do that to me. And I remember the first road rager I dealt with was this up and coming engineer. He was 28 years old. He was one of the fastest promotion individuals in Lockheed in their engineering program. He was already a middle manager. He was doing great, ambitious, smart, quick, approached everything aggressively, but unfortunately also did that on the road. And on his way to work one time, and on his way home from work, someone cut him off. He took it personally and felt like, for whatever reason, this was the last straw. And he literally followed the guy 8 miles home. Guy had no idea he had been followed. And before the guy could get out of his car, he drug him out of the car. He just started beating him. Police came, neighbors came, pull him off the guy. Literally went to prison. Lost his home, lost his job, lost his family. And all he could say when he was in my office is, I guess there's a part of me that's just crazy. And that was the beginning of my work with dealing with helping people understand how to navigate that that aggressive, energized world of emotion, especially anger, and recognize that it wasn't so much him, but him not respecting the power of that part of his brain and learning how to manage it. Because his brain, because of the modeling that he grew up with and so on, was you don't put up with that. You don't let people disrespect you like that. And those beliefs, and we're going to take a look at beliefs that really get us into trouble, was so powerful that it completely altered the course of a life that could have been very productive in so many ways. And so when James is kind of saying, I want you to invite your prefrontal cortex to the table before you do anything. Let that part of your brain be in charge. And look at the bigger picture here. Don't let your emotions have the first or last word. But certainly not the loudest word. Now think in scripture where we saw this. Impetuous was one of the ways of describing Peter, wasn't it? So the fight response took over Peter when they came to arrest Jesus, and he took out his sword and cut off the ear of a servant, right? And then you see a different response hours later, and now he's lying, hiding, and running away, fleeing. Both actions were run by the same system. Neither actions were run by his rational mind. And neither one of them made him look good, did it? So when we're invited to slow everything down, the minute we have one of those physical changes, we feel that chemistry within us wanting to act. We want to look at all the emotions of activation, which is anger, anxiety, fear, and panic. That the goal is to be counterintuitive and not given to acting on those emotions, but more giving into processing those emotions with the mind that God has given you. So you can take the time to invite wisdom into the equation. Because wisdom is the only thing that's going to answer. Because if you look at the first 3 chapters of the book of Proverbs, you'll find that wisdom was defined as 3 things. One of the words is knowledge, but it's a word that covers a lot more territory than that. It really involves perspective, seeing the big picture. So look at the invitation, look at things through the wide lens. Next word is insight, go deeper. I don't know what I don't know. So maybe I need to ask some questions and learn more. And the third term you keep on hearing in Proverbs is discernment. And that means knowing the difference between when something good is bad and when something bad is actually good. Discernment is recognizing that most things aren't a one size fits all. So when it is violating a commandment, a good thing. When God has a higher purpose, like Rahab, lying. because she wasn't lying, she was protecting God's spies with Joshua. Think about what happens when we have a one-size-fits-all mentality. You have the outrageous foolishness and even bizarreness of a man who was for 38 years paralyzed, just like Joni Tada and my friend Corky Riley. And now all of a sudden, he's not just saying he can feel things, he's actually walking as if he's got muscle tone for the last 38 years. And the only response that he's given is, what are you carrying that mat for? It's a Sabbath. Is that insane to you? Does that sound like a intellectually sound response? Or does that sound like limbic to you? What happens when people are threatened? Or the second one, man born blind. And what do they say? Well, how do you know he was blind? Well, because he was our son and he's always been blind. Ludicrous, outrageous, limbic. And the worst, Lazarus is raised. And what's their response? They can't deny it was raised. Too many witnesses. And now too many people have heard the story. And the Sanhedrin gets together and the only thing they say is, great, now everybody's going to believe him. Wow. Limbic. Emotional. Foolish. Missing the greatest truth and greatest event in human history. But blind because of emotion. So when we think in terms of how we run all of our emotions, we want to make sure that the regulation of them is built on slowing things down. Now, anxiety covers a lot of different territory. You see, there's several different forms of it. There's a thing called GAD, which is general anxiety disorder, where it's almost like this free-floating anxiety that just kind of carries around with you all day long. It just kind of drags you down and gives you this inner sense of discord. And then we have panic disorder, which is a person having such strong responses of almost terror. And on a regular basis, they have all the other symptoms of anxiety that most of us kind of relate to, in terms of tremors, in terms of heart rate up, respiration rate up, sense of dread and so on. Then we have PTSD. That used to be a word that was that evolved out of a term called shell shock syndrome, which was from the World Wars, where individuals were so emotionally impacted by the things that they saw and experienced that anything that was related to the smallest sound that would sound like they were back in the battle would cause them to relive it. Had situations where I used to live in San Jose, where in the 1980s, I had this phenomena of a lot of Vietnam vets, their spouses were calling. And they were calling in the middle of the night, and they called because my husband is, he's got an imaginary rifle in his hands, and he's turned the bed on its side, and he's waiting for the enemy to come over the hill. And is afraid the helicopter won't get here on time. And the reason why is because back then there was a thing called the Medfly, and twice a week, helicopters came by and sprayed all the foliage to protect them from dying, because this thing was a vicious plant killer and tree killer. But it wasn't a tree killer or plant killer to those Vietnam War vets. They were reliving the trauma, and the sound of a helicopter meant they only had seconds to get out of there. Then we have simple phobias, right? Where your fear has now been localized to a subject or a situation or an object because you had a bad experience related to that. And even though you're this adult and everybody else uses that elevator, you try to walk over to it, you think it's going to be fine. And all of a sudden, just before your foot crosses the threshold, you freeze. And your body will not let you get in there. Because it knows what happened last time when you were 4 years old and it broke down and you were there for 6 hours and you thought you'd never get out. Or we have separation anxiety, where usually with children and adolescents, but also with people that are older and feeling alone, where there's this sense of dread and sense of doom that something's going to happen. And the loneliness becomes toxic. So there's these different manifestations that anxiety can begin to develop within a person. And the protocols in each one of them is a little bit different. But the common theme of those dominant symptoms of what happens when people feel anxious is all similar. So I want to make a shift right now because you really can't talk about anxiety without talking about stress. Of course, no one in this room knows anything about stress, right? All right.
Thanks, buddy.
So one of the things that psychology likes to do is research, and they like to quantify things. And so if you know anything, the word stress is actually in the denotation of it or dictionary definition is actually a neutral term. It's any adjustive steps, changes an organism makes to adapt to its environment. The words that back in the 70s, when there was a lot of research on this, I'm going to share with you that in a moment. The word distress was the word for negative stress, and the word eustress was the name for positive stress. Because if you don't have any stress, in other words, you don't have any adaptive changes that you are moving toward, then you're not living. Because life is always about adaptation. In its best form, it's the cornerstone of all mental and emotional health. The more you're able to adapt. It's the foundation for the word that's become popular, resilience. So they try to quantify, so what does certain life events cost you, both positive and negative? And they had the scale of 1 to 100. And here's ones that were positive, but it still cost you. Getting married, 50 points. Marital reconciliation, 45 points. Pregnancy, 40 points. Outstanding personal achievement, 38 points. A change of habits like quitting smoking, 26 points. Vacation, 13 points. In other words, all these things involve a sense of change that people make. And what they really were trying to do is quantify when, based on what a person goes through, are they in trouble? And so the position they took was 150 points or less shows that you have a limited amount of change and you have low susceptibility to stress-induced health issues. 150 to 300, a 50% chance. 300 points or more, 80% chance. Now, I want to show you just from a circumstance point how quickly in a 6-month period of time points could ramp up. So let's start with major change in work responsibilities, 29 points. Let's say you just took a job and you got a promotion, but now you're working 60 hours a week, no longer 40, 45. Increase in marital arguments because of that 60 hours. That's 35 points. Sexual difficulties because of that increase in marital arguments. That's 39 points. Marital separation, because of all the stress of those things, 65 points. But you had a reconciliation, that was another 45 points. Then increase in marital arguments because the reconciliation was a little premature. Divorce, 73 points. Major change in financial situation, 38 points. Change in residence, 32 points. Now you're already up to 381 points in 6 months. Because negative changes period cost you, but negative changes really cost you. So managing the amount of change that you and I are going through, especially unwanted change, is an important part of managing your life. Because if you don't manage your life, your emotions come right around the corner. So this is more of that ounce of prevention to pay attention, because you live in I just moved away from a valley called Silicon Valley, known for its high stress, where people are automatically overextended, being judged by unrealistic expectations. They have resorted back to a thing called Theory X form of management, where Theory Y used to be incentives, encouragement, profit sharing. That's the best way to get people to perform. Give them positive reviews, give them perks. Where Theory X was, if you belittle, put down, criticize, threaten, that's the best way to get people to be motivated. And that got replaced in the 80s. And then in the 90s, when everybody thought they could have their own startup, now all of a sudden, self-reliance and free agency took over. And then when that didn't work out so well, back in the year 2000, now all of a sudden, companies had the power and they started moving more and more toward Theory X again. And in Silicon Valley, that happens a lot. And at any time you can lose your job, and that job that you had that you thought you'd have forever, you just bought a house with that job, you just bought a new car with that job, and now everybody else in your field has been laid off. And the company can get a new job. Talk about stress. If you went through this, they probably have close to 400 already since all those layoffs started. So it's important to start paying attention to that if you and I are going to manage our emotions, especially anxiety, because if we're making choices or we're in environments that by their very nature are anxiety producing, that you can only do for a period of time. Another phenomenon happened in the '70s, and that was in the late '60s. All of a sudden, there was a phenomenon that was happening that was basically putting a lot of jobs at risk. And the reason is because of the medical costs. And then there was an inordinate amount of individuals in middle management that were on disability, workman's comp, taking time off, and it was across the board. And that was also one of the things that was happening was another phenomenon I'll just mention in a minute, but they had used almost every major firm that was good at studying companies and so on and so forth, and nobody could figure out why. So they made the dreaded phone call to the authority on all stress research, a guy named Hans Selye, who actually wrote a book called Stress and Distress in the late '60s. And he came in and he looked at all the charts and all the medical reviews. And the one thing that everybody dismissed, he highlighted. It was a simple comment that almost every interviewer recorded of the person that they were interviewing. And the statement was, I don't understand why this happened to me. I've been doing this for such a long time. It's never been a problem before. And he saw that that was the problem. So he developed this, and this was also, if you remember, how many of you are old enough to remember the gas shortages? Gas lines, anybody? A few of you look in the back, some of those, right? You know, I remember having to get up early at 4 o'clock in the morning, park my car, and there's already 8 cars in front of it on the way to get gas at the gas pump. And came back at 7 when they opened up the gas station because I knew 30 cars meant the gas would be run out. And that's the way it was. So Hans Selye developed a thing using that analogy to describe actually what happened. And here's what it is. Anybody see that?
Yes, we can.
General adaptive syndrome.
Yes.
Okay. So what you had here was he was in normal life when, let's say, a crisis happens, you get that surge of adrenaline and you go up, you spike up, and you put out extra energy. But then after a while, you know, you come back down, get some rest, and you recover. See, as long as you average out 50, back then, that's when the law was 55 miles an hour. And that's in order to get to the gas station, you had to make sure that you never went more out of the average of that 55 miles an hour. Because all of us have these little spikes. But then what he did was said, here's what happened to all these people on disability. Can everybody see that? See, there was an alarm spike, right? All of a sudden they were saying, well, it looks like we're having a hostile takeover and we need to work 10-hour days, 7 days a week to make sure it doesn't happen. But instead of having a break where they got to recover the energy, all of a sudden then they said, well, we have a new product launch. Now we need to do 12-hour days, 6 days a week for 3 months. And then they said, well, now we need to downsize because so now you guys are gonna have to work 7 days a week for this and this. And so literally in Lockheed, National Semiconductor, and some of these places, people had cots at work. And they took pride in the fact that they slept there. They adapted. But how fast were they going? 85 miles an hour. Does your MPG go up with speed? No. And then C happened. So B was the adaptation stage where they just got used to working at that level. It was the new norm. And then C would happen. C is burnout. Now all of a sudden they're still doing it, but they're like robots doing it. No more like life, no more creativity, no more energy, no more passion. But you see, as long as somebody caught them here, then D didn't have to happen. Because when D happened, the exhaustion phase, there was permanent psychological or emotional or physical damage. There was no recovery. What's been helpful when he described this, the C is something I added. He just used to have, he didn't have any D, the C was the exhaustion phase. I put that in there because in my experience of the people I was working with, and they begin, and I could begin to see the trend that they were on. And I showed them the chart and I added my saying and said, right now you're dealing with burnout. We either get you out of there now or permanent damage is going to happen and your entire work life is going to come to an end or change. And it will not be good and healthy for you. And that's been very helpful as a motivator to get people to get out while they still could. So I bring those things up because sometimes the reason why we're anxious, we're in toxic situations. They're not good for us. Sometimes we're in toxic relationships that aren't good for us. And it's just a matter of time before all life will be removed from us and we'll be just robotic, going through the motions. No more passion, no more meaning, no more purpose, just going through the motions. So when people sometimes get paralyzed with anxiety where the threat has been tried, they've tried to deal with the threat for too long. And now their ability to adapt, because what Hans Selye found is that we have a quantifiable amount of adaptation energy. And once it's used up, it's used up. So it's been sad to me to see everything that we learned in the 80s and 90s be forgotten. And to see the trends that are happening now more and more that are just ruthless and are built on the needs of the people that are investors and not on the needs of the employees. When actually you get a better employee when you treat them better. And more that's replaced by a bottom line mentality. There's going to be more of this, and there's going to be another resurgence of this because I've already been seeing it in my office when I was working in San Jose. And part of it's being perpetuated by a mentality. So why don't you take a piece of paper out? I'm going to give you a test. Are you ready? It has 10 questions on it, or 10 statements. I want you to write that down in column 1 through 10. I want you to put a +2 if you strongly agree with the statement. +1 if you mildly agree. 0 if it's neutral. -1 if you mildly disagree. And -2 if you strongly disagree. Now, most of you will know what the right answer is. I don't want you to give in to that. I want you to rate these based on how you actually think typically.
Dean, can you pause for a second? Hang on. So if I understood correctly, few people asked, so if you go, +2 means you agree.
Strongly agree.
Right, 1 is agree.
Mildly agree.
Mildly agree, 0 is
Neutral.
-1.
Mildly disagree.
And -2.
Strongly disagree.
There you go. Colin's putting it on the whiteboard. Thank you.
Okay. But I want you to answer these based on your behavior, not based on what you know to be the right way to think. So you ask the question, is that how I've been living? Not, is that the right answer? So ready for number 1. If I do not set the highest standards for myself, I will end up becoming a second-rate person. Is that how I live? +2, +1, 0, -1, -2. Number 2, people will probably think less of me if I make a mistake. Is that how I think? Not how I should think, but is that how I think? +2, +1, 0, -1, -2. Number 3, if I cannot do something really well, there's little point in doing it at all. Is that how I operate? Not what the right answer is. Because some of these you say, well, I know I shouldn't think that, but is that how I think? Number 4, I should be upset if I make a mistake. Do I get upset when I make mistakes? Say, I know I shouldn't. Oh, but I do. Right. Number 5, if I try hard enough, I should be able to excel at anything I attempt. Is that what I believe? Not whether I should believe it, but is that how I operate and believe? Number 6. It is shameful for me to display weaknesses or foolish behavior. Is that where I go? Do I go to shame?
Repeat that question.
Not whether I should. Go ahead.
Can you repeat that question?
This again. It is shameful for me to display weaknesses or foolish behavior. In other words, do I go to shame when that happens? Not whether I should go, but do I go? Number 7. I should not ever repeat the same mistake many times. Is that my attitude? Am I pretty critical of myself if I make the same mistake more than once? Number 8. An average performance is bound to be unsatisfying to me. Do I get pretty unsatisfied if I only get a C? Number 9. Failing at something important means I am less of a person. Is that how I act toward myself when I fail? Not what I should do, but is that how I act toward myself if I do? Last but not least, if I scold myself for failing to live up to my expectations, it will help me perform better in the future. If I scold myself for failing to live up to my expectations, it will help me perform better in the future. Is that what I do? When I don't live up to my expectations, do I scold myself as if it's going to make me do better? Am I self-critical? Do I make judgments against myself? I know I shouldn't, but is that what I do? Add up the scores. Everybody got it completed? Anything over a total score of +2 is perfectionism. Do I hear any wows out there? 0 to do, perfectionistic tendencies, 3 to 5, moderate, 6 to 8, significant, 9 to 10, severe. Now, most of you know we probably shouldn't have those responses, right? Shouldn't +2 any of those, right? But kind of hard to, if you're really honest, that's where our brain goes, doesn't it? How many of you had a plus score? Yeah. But see, each one of these is built on a performance-based programming. And the difference between pursuing excellence and being performance-based is twofold. And that is, people that are pursuing excellence do not hold themselves to the same accountability as a performance-based person. See, a performance-based, anything they do is outcome oriented. You could say, yeah, but you hit 3 home runs. Yeah, but we still lost. That'd be their thinking. You had 45 points. Yeah, but we still lost. Where a person pursuing excellence would say, we lost, but I had my best game ever. They wouldn't have to devalue what they did do because of the outcome. The second thing that's almost lethal, and that is the individual that is performance-based, they will identify with the outcome. If I lost, I'm a loser. If I failed, I'm a failure. Or if it was, I got a lower grade in the test, I guess I'm stupid. So you see how that would fund anxiety? If that's what the stakes were every time that I'm taking a test or doing a project, that my entire self-image is on the line every time? Wouldn't that make you a little bit anxious? If one test was going to determine whether I graduated, one test. So I bring these things up because I don't want you to be victims of that. So let's talk a little bit about what to do about anxiety. Can we do that? First thing, and this is not just for you that have issues with anxiety, but you that know people. The first thing we have to do is exercise some discernment. Eliminate all the other possible causes of what they're experiencing. Have they been tested for hyperthyroid? Every symptom of anxiety is true about people that have hyperthyroidism. Every one of them. So always have, when's the last time your thyroid was checked? Now the key is that people that have hyperthyroidism have a couple other things. They'll have bulging eyes and they'll sweat hot, not cold. But everything else is almost a mirror of anxiety. Is it possible they have hypoglycemia? The shakiness, the heart rate, irritability, nausea, difficult concentrating, panic, all the things that replicate anxiety are right there. Because hypoglycemia, they're getting increased doses of epinephrine, which mimics anxiety. The difference between an anxious person and one that has hypoglycemia is that you can't stabilize an anxious person with sugar, where you can with hypoglycemia. Have they ever been tested for MVP? Mitral valve prolapse. That's where one of the valves has some leakage and blood gets through. And as a result of that, they'll have anxiety symptoms, increased heart rate, panic, tremors, all the same thing. It only can be diagnosed by a cardiologist. Have they had that checked out? So my third experience with anxiety myself was on an airplane. And I used to love to fly, look forward to it, always felt relaxed, comfortable. But in this particular time, the plane was stuck on the tarmac for 45 minutes. Unbeknownst to me, they turned off the air during that 45 minutes. And it got thicker and thicker and thicker. And as I'm reading a book I was really into, all of a sudden I noticed that I could only get a half a breath. And no matter how much I tried, I couldn't get more than that. Eventually, I leaned over to my wife and said, something's wrong. I can't breathe. And because of some other training I've had and relaxation, hypnosis, etc., I thought I'd try to use those things. But all my hypnosis training was always based on breathing, and breathing was out of the question. So that wasn't working. Tried to distract myself with other sensations, but you know, your brain doesn't like not breathing. And I felt this voice in me getting louder and louder. It says, Dean, you have to get off this plane. You have to get off this plane. You have to get off this plane. And I argued with that voice, said no, because we're on the tarmac. They'd have to put the plane back in, and they'd probably not going to let me get back on. I can't do that. And after 45 minutes, I was thinking about waiting for my fingers to turn blue. And we got off the air, and I was thinking, well, maybe when we get in there, it'll be fine. And it wasn't fine. And now the voice in my head was screaming. I was totally activated. And I kept on standing up, trying to breathe. But my head said, tell them to land and get you off this plane now. Do it. Do it. Do it. We're going to die. That's what I was hearing. And kept on going back and forth to the bathroom, expecting to pass out any time. And then all of a sudden it lifted. But it didn't lift after I had a conversation with God in the toilet room. And I was said, Lord, if this is my time, because there's no way, if this is a heart attack, there's nothing they can do about it now anyway. So I got a will. I don't have any unfinished business. It's okay. Thank you so much for the life you've given me. You've given me this. Thank you for that. I don't mean to be ungrateful. And I walked back to my seat. And slowly but surely, there was a calm that came. I still was having some trouble breathing, but eventually it went away. We had a layover in Arizona, and I got off the plane and I made a plan. I was going to get a car, have my wife get back on the plane. She was going to go to the destination. I would just drive there. And then I remembered what it was. I hadn't had an asthma attack for 35 years. And that's what this was. So asthma at times can mimic, because both have air hunger. Anxiety has air hunger, so does asthma. The difference is that when you're anxious, you're hyperventilating. With asthma, you have an airway constriction. Very different. Then there's a paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia. That's a big word. It's a special form of rapid heartbeat, and it can only be measured by having a Holter monitor that a doctor gives you. And also certain tumors do the same thing. They can reproduce the same thing. So let's make sure it's nothing physical, because that's an easier fix. Second is, let's be preventative. Number one, review what you now know about emotions of activation, and that is the importance of thinking versus reacting. Don't wait till an event to challenge the thoughts and beliefs that you operate under that are not true. Like that perfection scale, I would want you, if you want, I can email you a lot of this stuff, and I'd want you to challenge identify why every one of those 10 statements is flawed and why. I'd have you also look at the Helm stress rating scale and look at your life right now and ask yourself, what are the things that I'm actually living with right now that are setting me up for stress and therefore anxiety? And how can I make a more active plan to eliminate them? How can I move toward a grace and growth orientation, not a performance orientation? Where actually I value handling losing better, or handling losing well better than I evaluate winning the game. And now begin to practice reframing your anxiety as being hijacked by your emotional brain. But reminding yourself that I have a better brain waiting to be engaged. I need to do exactly what James said. I need to slow everything down, not rush to judgment, and say, right now, something important is happening. I don't even know. I'm not even going to say it's bad yet because I don't know. But something important that's worthwhile to figure out. And I'm going to figure out before I take any action or make any conclusion. Next thing I'm going to do, and I can't emphasize this enough because it applies to almost everything in life, and that is developing a rehearsal program. And now, what does that mean? When I mentioned to you earlier about the road rage people I've had, we've always had a rehearsal program. So the rehearsal program looks like this. When they get into their car, before they're allowed to start the engine, there's a card that they have to read. And the card says this: sometime today or this week, I'm going to be triggered by one of the following behaviors on the road. And when I'm triggered, I'm going to handle it really well. And here's what well looks like. And road rage goes something like this. I don't know what I don't know. So as far as I know, the person that just did that might have just found out they got cancer. They might have just found out that they got served with divorce papers. They might have just got notice that their job is ending in a month. I don't know. So Lord, because I don't know, I'm going to pray for them right now. That whatever's causing them to be distracted, whatever causing them to not focus on their driving, whatever causing them to be aggressive, please give them peace where they don't have peace. And I'm going to call two people tonight and talk about how well I handled it. Then and only then do they get to start their car. Now, what do you think happens to somebody that has to read that every day for 3 weeks? They're building a neural pathway to access that response by pure repetition. Because the file in their brain right now is that anytime somebody does that, they gets translated as disrespect, and I got to show them. But when you fill that file with this new data over and over and over again, you literally reach a tipping point where it's the loudest voice more than the one of disrespect. And now they have access to a whole different response. Think about somebody that has speech anxiety. I've never met any of you before. How do I know you'll even like me? How do I know you won't think I'm a crazy psychologist or something like that? Is that worry going to do me any good in terms of performing better? No. I'm going to get hijacked. But if I frame it like, what's another way I could define this moment? Instead of looking at you as, so many eyes that are critical and making judgments about me, so many eyes that are hungry to learn. I don't know whether you're hungry to learn or you're criticizing me, but I can choose to believe one versus the other, can't I? I can choose to believe that God's the one that arranged this meeting, so he wouldn't arrange it unless it was to do something important for the kingdom. So I'm glad to be part of it. So that means I get to control the narrative of how I define the moment. But I only can do that if I've been practicing. What's another way of looking at this than the way I'm looking at it that's causing me to be so frightened, so fearful, and so on? You know, one of the most popular triggers for anxiety is a little phrase. You know what the phrase is called? What if? Any of you ever have those negative what ifs? Anybody? What if this happens? What if that happens? Right? I know people that are paralyzed by that. But what if you had a rehearsal program and you said, I'm going to sometime today or this week, some negative what ifs are going to knock on my door and I'm going to handle them really well. And what well looks like is I'm going to apply the rule of all relationships of 5 positives for every negative. Did you know that's the rule in relationships? Did you know that? 5 praises for every criticism. In healthy relationships that thrive and survive, that's the ratio in every study that's been done. So imagine I do that with myself or with this. So I have to come up with 5 positive what ifs before I even play with 1 negative. And I have to write out those 5 positive what ifs. What am I doing? I'm creating competitive movement neurologically where I can park instead of what I've been doing. There's a phrase that we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks that does the same thing for depression, guilt, and grief. And when you have a counter for it, it loses its power. Second, besides those prevention things, and that is be prepared. And that is part of it, preparing your mind. And that is, remember, you're not an atheist. Now, what do I mean by that? That's one of my major issues with me. I act like an atheist a lot of the time. You know what that means? I act like I'm on my own. I'm not. The Lord's with me every day. But I act like it's not true. So a lot of my worry and anxiety comes directly from thinking all this is on my shoulders only. I have the one who says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will bear your burden for you. So I need to remember that. Number 2, invite Jesus into the moment. Lord, how do you want to live your life through me in this moment? I'm going to be a situation where I'm exposed to one of my phobias. How do you want to live your life through that, through me? How do you look at this right now? Number 3, go back to the future. What that means is project yourself 24 hours later and ask yourself, if you felt really great about how you handled this moment, what did you do differently? And reverse engineer it. The 4th one, which is maybe the most practical, because again, I want you to access your neocortex, right? Because here, things that if you continue, because remember, all your chemistry is back here. When you're already accelerated, you have about 1.5 minutes to get out of there. And if you don't, you already are filled up with those catecholamines, adrenaline, norepinephrine, and it's going to take you a couple of hours to detox. So you want to catch it early. And one of the best ways to do that is to go to a place where anxiety is not. You know where anxiety isn't? It's not in gratitude. So the minute you start feeling anxious, write down 25 things you're grateful for. The magic isn't in the writing. The magic is you're forcing the brain chemistry to go forward to the front part of your brain, because that's where those answers are. The limbic system has nothing to tell you about gratitude, only getting out of the burning building. Or what are 10 people I could encourage or pray for right now? The answer is here in your neocortex. That's where those memories are. That's where the experiences are. It's not back here. So literally, when you ask the question, your search engines force movement chemistry forward. Literally. Just like with the gratitude list, if you had to do 25, I guarantee by number 15, you're already lessening the chemistry and slowing down all that process. So you're forcing those norepinephrines and adrenal glands that have already excreted to now retreat. Or what are the 7 things that I feel the most proud of in my own progress and growth? The answer to that is not in your limbic system. It's here. So again, you're literally helping your brain not get jacked up with those chemicals that are part of your survival brain. Final piece I would just add is have people who support you and will affirm your success on standby. So know you can immediately call them and tell them about your success, or have them help you find your success to remind you that you got hijacked and to help you go to your gratitude and so on and so forth because you forgot. Now, for you that are trying to help others, imagine they're in the middle of that and you just start asking, so tell me another thing you're grateful for. Well, I don't know. That's all right. Just to keep on working. It's one thing that you're grateful for. Just one thing you're grateful for. Well, I guess I'm grateful for. Oh, good. Tell me one more thing. What are you doing? You're not telling them not to be anxious, but you're redirecting them away from anxiety. Because gratitude by its very nature is calming, soothing, affirming. Any questions? Is that making sense?
Yep.
If you just think about this being a chemical issue and your job is to manage the chemistry, not feed it, but redirect it. Because you're right, telling myself not to be anxious doesn't work. Telling myself not to be afraid doesn't work. Criticizing myself and saying I shouldn't be afraid, what's wrong with you? That really doesn't work. Now you've convinced me to be anxious and ashamed. Combo. What a great combo. Mm-hmm. So now it's time for your questions. Anything that you would like to know more of? Questions about anything I've shared?
Yeah, guys, so
I'll try to a lot of
just a few-
stuff into our time. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, so we're about 6 minutes after 11, so we've got about 20 minutes of question time. Be safe. Don't feel forced to do it, but if you got some, put your hand up and yell them out. Not at the same time, but
Way in the back.
I'm really, I need the video, so I wondered when it might be available.
okay, yeah, so I'm recording the video. I haven't recorded off Zoom before, so assuming I can get this together, we'll get it out this next week.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you.
What kind of Bible studies or books come to mind on this topic that we're talking about?
Well, for just reducing it to anxiety, there's certainly the anxiety workbook that a lot of people found a lot of practical help from. It's not a Christian book, so it's not going to be not integrate scripture and that kind of thing. I think there's certainly some other books. I've just probably for the most part, I've just used my own work to work with the people that I do. So anxiety workbook has been kind of a good adjunct to that, but that's the best I could tell you now.
Yeah, we'll have a list actually this weekend, via our QR code gateway to everything. There'll be some resources there. Yeah.
kind of a broad question, but where would you draw the line as far as like a spiritual oppression that might contribute to anxiety versus biology and how to treat that?
Well, again, if I eliminate those 5 things I already mentioned, there's no tumor, there's no issue with insulin, there's no issue with hypothyroidism, there's none of those things, then my sense would be it's going to be a mixture of cognitive and spiritual. You know, and certainly if it's a spiritual issue, that's going to become more and more clear if one of the major things you do is ask them to invite Jesus into the moment. There's going to be a lot of resistance to that. Almost a repulsion.
And then do you have any resources on having healthy relationships with a family member diagnosed with borderline personality disorder? And what that could look like?
Is that possible? I probably, if you were to ask the question differently and you asked me, is there ways of managing those kind of interactions with people that would maybe fit that diagnosis, if you will? I'm going to tell you something funny. It probably is kind of disrespectful, but I'll tell it to you anyway. And that is, we used to have a kind of a humor in our field that that was the diagnosis you gave people you didn't like. You know, we got to remember a lot of the diagnoses that you'll hear, these are all man-made up terms. You know, so we'll have, there's the super sensitive person, there's the borderline personality person, there's the, I wish they'd come up with OPD. You know what that would be? Obnoxious personality disorder. But that wouldn't be popular. So to me, it's really all about leading people to self-examine, you know, the things that they're doing that are self-destructive. And my experience, even with people that have that diagnosis, I don't choose to label them as a this or that. I look at them as still as a human being. And they have the same opportunities other human beings do to make steps toward health. And either they make those steps or they don't. And my experience has been that I've seen people make movement out of that, but they had to be really motivated, and they had to have no reinforcement for their disorder, because a lot of these disorders are ones where they got actually reinforcement, attention, etc., for their disorder. I remember the individual years ago that said, and we'll just say, I'll just say it neutrally, went to the therapist and said, "You'll be so glad to work with me." And I said, "Well, you know why?" And I said, "No." And the person said, "Because I'm a classic anxiety neurotic. My last 3 psychiatrists said I'm a classic case." And you know what the appropriate response was? "Well, who are you if you're not a classic?" Because that was their identity. Why would you give it up if that's your identity? So if we don't describe, if we don't get you to buy into a newer identity that you'd have to work toward, then I don't see any reason to work with you, because you're satisfied with where you are. So that's the part of the problem with our field is my field is responsible for almost some of the worst things that are going on in our culture that have been validated by people in my field and actually promoted. It's probably one of the reasons why I moved out of California, because I wasn't willing to support certain things. And the more people have an identity other than Christ, then they're going to be hungry to hold on to that and expect everybody else to endorse it. Any other questions?
be able to hear that?
Well, I didn't hear everything you said. Mark, could you expand on what she said?
Yeah, the short version, her nephew is getting removed from his apartment because of some behavior, being evicted tomorrow. And she was saying, it seems like, yeah, this whole frontal cortex thing might be an issue. He's not slowing down to think and respond. She said, what can I do? Is just pray, or that's kind of where she landed on that.
Right. Well, everything else, it certainly, even if just to pray for you for wisdom would be a great thing. And you certainly want to discern to what degree are you dealing with someone that's teachable? And maybe the prayer would be that God would use this situation to make him teachable, to make him hungry, to be open on a level that he hasn't been open before. Because you're not going to get very far if he still has a victim mentality or a defensive mentality. And then there's no growth there. And some of these situations are pretty inevitable just because of the negative patterns the person's been in for so long. So again, I don't know enough details about that situation, but certainly those would be two areas I'd lean into. And that's why one of the reasons I love the phrase, do you want to be wisdom driven or emotionally driven? When I've done instructions at schools, dealing with school staffs, and this is public schools, and they'll bring me in for like an intervention or what it would be. That's one of the first things I ask them is do we want to, at the end of the day, be driven by wisdom or emotion? And you know, it's interesting that word isn't offensive to people. Isn't that interesting? Everybody finds wisdom attractive. So I'll quote a lot of proverbs they don't even know I'm quoting, and I can just talk about ancient literature and they don't know, they'll realize it's the Bible, and they all respond well. But it's always going to be fundamental to that. Are you teachable and are you committed? And if you're not one of those, then you're only going to go so far.
Anything else, sir? I have one I'm going to throw out. You guys don't have any more.
I think one of the questions I have is like with that test, like I fall into a place where I'm very high on the scale. And so, but you're going,
Me
okay,
too.
what's that?
Me too.
Right. And as I lean into that and I go like tools towards dealing with that, like not like it's from that biblical standpoint of who we are in Christ and knowing that we're not perfect. But however, like you said, knowing when Paul says we do what we do not want to do and the things we want to do, we do not do, you know, I know I shouldn't be doing that stuff, but I find myself acting in that manner. So.
Well, if you wanted to reprogram yourself, you'd probably have to do a rehearsal program. You'd have to, first of all, be the rebuttal of every one of those. And then you make a commitment for 30 days. I'm going to actually say to myself and out loud, this thinking is flawed because of this, and this is my new thought pattern I'm going to try to install. You know, for example, which one was the hardest to come up with a rebuttal? What?
Yeah, I was in the strongly agree on a couple, you know. So
Okay. Which ones, what numbers for those?
1, 2, 4, 6, 7.
Okay, good. So 7 is the most popular one. That seems so natural, right?
Yep.
So can you imagine any rebuttal to that?
Well, I mean, I know that, you know, as I'm being critical of myself, like that's not where God wants me to be, you know, and I look at that. And being supported by people who are not being critical in the same situation. I'm being supported, but I'm still finding myself stuck in it. But
Gotcha.
it's just tools.
But it's like that. But the one I'm talking about is I should not ever repeat the same mistake many times, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at that as that's erroneous because it all depends on what mistake I'm making. Thomas Edison made 2000 minus 1 mistakes on filaments for the light bulb. It all depends on how complex of a situation I'm dealing with. Every mistake is bringing me closer to mastery. The more complex the situation is. So the idea that I should be perfectly unconsciously competent at anything that I'm not competent at is the devil's expectation, not mine. And it's not like Lucifer has lived up to that. Not like he's makes no mistakes. So it's kind of hypocritical for him to try to accuse me in that area. He made the biggest mistake, thinking he could compete with God. It was like, wow. So, or let's say if I try hard enough, well, if you're 3 feet tall, what's the odds of you dunking a ball in a 10-foot basket?
Depends who's throwing you.
There you go. Unless somebody throws me, that's not going to happen. So if again, look at these and challenge them and say, what's wrong with them? And especially if I ask myself, what would grace allow me to see? And identify what are the top 10 things I've been critical of myself for, and what would a compassionate, gracious response be instead? Then I'm teaching myself to look at things differently and reframing it.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean. Yeah, I want to, if I could, just
Go ahead.
drop in, we can wrap up with this and just take a minute. I'd like to just pray, if that's okay. You know, you in your bit about James 1:19, I thought that was just such a wonderful bit to unpack. And I think you said something that we could easily miss. You said something important just happened. I need to pay attention to that. I need to slow
Right.
down. And I know for myself, sitting with you in a couple of our sessions, I shared something about being angry about a certain circumstance. And I said, it scared me that I was angry. And you said, maybe a better way to frame that is, it's important. It's an important feeling. So I think there's something in this, just maybe you could just briefly touch on the importance of honoring that emotion in that moment, honoring that,
Okay.
and then allowing that to take to the next step and slow down, just in the maybe take a couple minutes and unpack that. Then we could pray out.
I think what you're talking about more in a generic way is a belief that I have is how words are so important. Because words have meaning, right? For example, if I say something's difficult or if something's hard, that might be an accurate description, but it's not a helpful one. If instead I say, no, this is incredibly important, that's a very different description, and the emotions that go with that are very different. I get pulled in by it being important. I have to push myself in if it's difficult and hard. Hear the difference there? And so when you're only looking at things through a lens that's maybe critical, then you don't see the times when you're being courageous. You don't see the times when you're doing something that's new and different, and you're getting encouragement and praise and affirmation because you did that. And so the same thing with yourself. If I take the position, one thing that I didn't mention, and that is that I think it's important to develop what you call an observer self. Whether you want to call that the wise self or what it would be, the one that Christ is in charge of, and that can step outside of you and direct you and talk to you the way Jesus would talk to you. Because if you can do that, then you can step outside the chemistry and be caring about the person that's having the chemistry. So I've taught myself over time when I get upset to pull Dean aside. Sometimes this will even happen when I'm in a session. And I'll say, I need to use the restroom. And I'll go to the restroom and I'll simply say, hey, Dean, what's going on? That wasn't like you. Feels like something important is here. And I'm ready to listen. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? And I'm not going to judge you for it. I'm talking to myself the way I wish people had talked to me. And after a while, you get in that habit of doing that, you begin to actually step into the compassionate Christ that's within you. And you're talking to that part of you that's struggling. And your compassion for yourself will not make you complicit in just continuing to sin. It actually will invite you to have a deeper understanding of God's grace and the way he loves you, and continues to invite you to be the better person. It's like sin and guilt. And we'll talk a little bit more about this next time, but if you look at guilt as my friend, because most people don't look at guilt as their friend. Did you know that? They hate talking about guilt and they hate feeling guilty. But next time we get together, I'll share with you ways of looking at guilt that actually will make it your friend. So how you and I define things, how you and I frame things, and just the language that we use with ourselves, the more gracious it is, the more loving it is, the more it's affirming, the more it's, again, if I had to say five positive things about myself every time I heard myself saying something critical, I think my self-esteem would be better. And so would yours.